and welcome to tonight's event. Thank you for joining us. I'm Shannon Powell, one of the directors of No Surrender New York. We are so honored to have Daniel Goldman with us tonight. Dan is a former federal prosecutor with the Southern District of New York. He served as lead counsel to House Democrats during the first impeachment investigation of Donald Trump and is a former candidate for Attorney General of New York. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Shannon. It's great to be here and great to participate in this forum for what is, I think, a really smart, creative, and important PAC that you guys have started.
Thanks so much. Well, we're here today because it marks the one-year anniversary of the insurrection, and we're all joining tonight because we know that the threat to our democracy remains. And that's one of the reasons why we launched No Surrender New York. Our co-director, Tom Watson, is going to talk a little bit more now about our mission. Tom?
Thank you, Shannon. And Dan, it's great to have you here. It's great to have everyone here. I see the chat is flying along. I think we're going to share a few slides here, and I'll take you through basically what No Surrender New York is. We're playing offense and taking the fight to the radical right in New York State. If you could just skip ahead, one more slide, one more after that. We are taking on the extremist right with a powerful message here because it will make a difference. This cycle, we have a chance to pick up seats here in New York and to hold the House for Democrats. Next slide, please. This week, the New York Times noted our call to the state legislature to draw districts that can maximize possible Democratic pickups. The prestigious Cook Political Report centered New York in the fight to hold the House and block a Speaker McCarthy and committee chairs like Boebert, Green, and Cawthorn. None of us want to see that happen. Next slide, please. Our strategy is to be that firewall. Don't listen to the defeatism that you may hear in the media. We can do this, but it's important to build resources and a stronger infrastructure here in New York, and that's what New York and that's what No Surrender New York is aimed at doing. Next slide. Today is a really important day for all of us to remember. These four Republicans on your screen from New York shamed our state a year ago today. No Surrender New York is working to defeat them. And we're building a long-term project that empowers Democrats all around this state. We need to be on the offensive. We cannot give in to the framework of the radical right. And we will be on the offensive with your help. We just go to the next one. So we're here to have a wonderful forum and to ask for your help. We would love your support. So let's get right to our discussion with Dan because it's central to the work that we are doing here.
All right, thanks so much, Tom. All right, let's get started. Dan, let's start with some background. Where were you a year ago on January 6th, and what went through your mind as this day unfolded?
It was pretty startling. I was actually on vacation and I started getting tons of text messages from my friends saying, are you watching what's going on? And they were so alarmist. I actually thought they were joking. I thought, what do you mean there's a riot at the Capitol? And so I flipped on the TV and obviously saw what everyone else saw too. And what really strikes me so much as I think back to what was going on that day is watching Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher going on CNN and saying publicly, the president needs to call this off. The president needs to be the one to tell everybody to go home. And what so clearly had occurred and was that Donald Trump was just not doing anything to stop this, but everyone knew that he could stop it if he wanted to. And that has really stuck with me. When there's all of this discussion about, oh, well, it was the breach of security, it was, or the limited security around the Capitol, or problems with the security, or problems with intelligence or communication of what was going on. And all that may be true, but Democrats and Republicans alike all knew that the only person who could call this off and stop what was going on was Donald Trump. And as a former prosecutor, that's pretty good evidence that he was at a minimum who everyone was listening to and had encouraged, incited, however you want to describe it. And I'm going to be a little bit cautious with some of the words I use because of my experience as a prosecutor and the difference between making accusations, and then also having the evidence to back it up. And what we are learning even in the last week, as an example, when the text messages from Mark Meadows is coming out, is Ivanka Trump was asking her dad to call it off. Don Jr. was trying to have him call it off. Sean Hannity was trying to have him call it off. Everybody knew who was responsible for what was going on. And that man who was responsible did not do anything for 2.5 hours other than, as Stephanie Grisham said, gleefully watch the riot on television. So those memories are very seared in my head.
So Dan, why do you think it's important to uncover the truth? We talk so much about the truth and how important the truth is. Why, again, is it important to uncover the truth behind what happened and who is responsible? You mentioned some of the people you think are responsible, but that's only the tip of the iceberg.
Well, there are a lot of different variables and a lot of different answers to that question. I think, from the sort of most basic level is, I think Congress does need to understand what transpired in order to figure out whether and to what extent additional legislation is needed, additional security is needed, additional actions are needed to make sure that something like the breach of the Capitol never happens again. That's sort of on the lowest level. Then you just have I think, frankly, the way out of this complete mess that we're in. And when I say complete mess, I'm talking about this anti-democratic authoritarian strain that is spreading like a plague through the Republican Party, still controlled by Donald Trump a year later. But the only way that we are going to be able to see our way out of it is through discovering the truth. And I know it may sound a little quaint and a little rosy-eyed, but the bottom line is that as long as we keep emphasizing the facts and the truth, that's what our country is founded on. That's what the rule of law is founded on. That's what our democracy and democratic institutions are founded on. And I sincerely believe that at the end of the day, the truth will win out. And we just have to continue to investigate this from the committee, from DOJ. But we also, as advocates, as Democrats, as people who believe strongly in democracy and our fundamental rights, voting rights, et cetera, we cannot give in to this whitewashing of what occurred on January 6th. We cannot give in to the Republican efforts to politicize everything. And that was something that struck me so much from even the first impeachment, was that we started this investigation as when we got wind of some of the stuff that was going on in Ukraine. And we just moved forward with the investigation to try to figure out what was going on, why Rudy Giuliani was over there so much, what was behind it all. And it didn't need to be a partisan investigation. And in fact, it wasn't. All of our witnesses were part of the Trump administration, either current or former. But the defense that the Republicans mounted was to basically allege that because the Democrats were leading the investigation, it was therefore partisan, and they were not going to participate in it in any meaningful way. They were going to go to the defense of Donald Trump. And then when it came time to vote for impeachment, it was a completely circular argument. They said, oh, we can't vote for impeachment because it was a partisan witch hunt or whatever language they wanted to make. But it wasn't actually partisan. They just created this straw man that they then relied on to vote against it. And it was all of their own creation. And that is the script that they have been trying to do since before then, and including them, including up until now. And so, we saw it today. I mean, the fact that no Republican member of Congress, other than Liz Cheney, was at the Capitol to commemorate what happened a year ago is absolutely stunning. And the basis for it that they say is, oh, the Democrats are politicizing January 6th. I mean, give me a break. That is a completely preposterous allegation that is clearly their go-to explanation for everything and justification for everything, is that if they can accuse other people of being partisan, then they make it partisan. And then it's just, oh, Democrats versus Republicans, same old stuff. We can't let that happen. We have to continue to push forward with the truth, to push forward with the facts, to not give in any way, and to not allow them to control the narrative. And that's why, I'm excited about what you guys have started, because there's so much of all of this is messaging, so much of it. And Donald Trump is brilliant at that. I mean, he says the same, one or two words over and over and over and over again, and he controls the narrative by doing that. And we cannot allow this completely sham characterization that it's politicized or partisan. We cannot allow that to control. We have to keep pushing forward, because the truth will set us free. I truly believe that.
So, Dan, I totally agree. And it was stunning to see Liz Cheney and her father, basically standing there as the only two figures from the Republican Party. As a former federal prosecutor and as a impeachment prosecutor, as a congressional prosecutor, as you look at the work of the January 6th committee, what's your take on it? Where do you think it goes from here? How important is the testimony that they're taking and the way they're taking it? What are the limits of the committee's power? Because a lot of people are looking at that committee as a way to get the truth out.
Well, I think that the committee is a way to get the truth out. The committee, of course, is not a way to enlist or put forward any serious consequences for the actions of those who were involved. So the best case scenario and is that the committee gets access to all of the documents it wants, all of the witnesses it wants, and is able to come up with a very comprehensive report and accounting of what occurred on that day, who was involved in setting it up, who coordinated with it, and how it all came to be and what then occurred on that day, and what are the recommendations for new legislation, for amending current legislation, for the security of the Capitol. That's the best case scenario. I think to that end, the committee is doing a fabulous job from what I can glean from the outside. They are moving at a blistering pace. They are working tirelessly in quiet to put together this accounting that we want. And I know there's a lot of frustration, the Twitterverse and elsewhere, about the fact that the committee is not taking the public along with them as they do this investigation. And as someone who did a significant congressional investigation, and as someone who was a prosecutor for 10 years, I can tell you that the way that they are doing this is the right way to do it. And I can explain why. We're all dying to get the information. We want the information. But the committee is in a fact-finding mode. They don't know what the facts are. And what is important in finding the facts is not allowing witnesses to line up their stories, not allowing some witnesses to see some of the documents that they have in their possession until they are confronted with them during a deposition. That the reason, other than grand jury secrecy, the reason why criminal investigations are confidential is not necessarily, is for a variety of reasons, but one of them is because the best way to get to the truth is to be able to interview everyone confidentially, to be able to gather the documents and put together the case. Just like we did with the impeachment, where we had a number of depositions, and because we were trying to figure out what the facts were, what they will do is they will then have public hearings. But those public hearings, rather than a 10-hour hearing with one witness asking a lot of questions where the answer is, I don't know, or no, I had nothing to do with it, they're going to be able to package the information, the facts that they've developed in a much more compelling, persuasive, and shorter way. And that will be to our benefit in the public, because people will not sit through these depositions watching them. They will be bored to tears, but they will sit through the public hearings, which are able to highlight the key elements of the various witnesses' testimony, the documents. And so the way that they are going about doing it is the correct way from an investigative standpoint. And ultimately, it's a correct way from the public standpoint in terms of being able to understand what actually happened and what they found. So I think the committee's been doing a great job. A couple of problems. The first problem is there's no great enforcement mechanism for congressional subpoenas. And so there's the contempt charge that is currently against Steve Bannon, and they've referred over Mark Meadows. Even if they are tried and convicted, their punishment does not include being compelled to testify. Their punishment will be potentially jail, which is a deterrent, but they won't be compelled to testify. And I think there are likely going to be a host of others who give half-hearted cooperation, but don't tell the full story or don't give all the documents that they have. And there's no good way at this point to enforce those subpoenas. So unfortunately, I don't think that the committee is going to get access to everyone that they would like to get access to. So it will not be a 100% complete story. But I do think that it will be pretty complete. And I think that for people who do not cooperate, they risk allowing others to tell the story for them, which is never a good thing. And so there is risk for those who are not going to cooperate. But this is where the Department of Justice comes in. And, in terms of a parallel criminal investigation, the grand jury subpoena is a much more powerful weapon than a congressional subpoena, largely because it carries with it the possibility of being imprisoned if you do not comply with it, which is something that congressional subpoenas enforcement, it doesn't exist right now. And so, the Department of Justice, I hope, is not only looking at the insurrectionists who invaded the Capitol on January 6th, not only looking at the people who organized January 6th and who may have conspired to obstruct the vote counting of the Electoral College, which was obviously what was transpiring in the Capitol that day. But I hope they will look at the larger effort to overturn the election. And that, I think, is where you're going to find much more involvement and much more criminal liability by Donald Trump, or for Donald Trump, and for the White House. And so, I think it's possible for us to get the full story from both the sort of best aspects of both investigations. But there's a lot of work to be done on both sides.
So that's terrific insight, and I think it explains the process well. There is, we heard the Attorney General yesterday give I thought, a pretty strong speech about a thorough and tough investigation. Understandably, we could see it actually in the chat. There is, there's some frustration, I think, on what people expect to be, the pace of an investigation to be, into Trump, his advisors, the top people behind the attack on the Capitol. What is your sense? And I know you're a careful commentator on this, Dan, and a former federal prosecutor yourself. What is your sense of that investigation, its pace, and what people should expect going forward?
So, I see a lot of people out there who, understandably want blood. And what I mean by that is people want Donald Trump to go to jail. And it's a sentiment that I heard on the campaign trail when I was running for Attorney General for that hot minute. It's a sentiment I've seen all over. And I would say this to those people, and it's exactly what I said on the campaign trail. We cannot be a country founded on the rule of law if we use our political views as part of the criminal justice system and as part of the prosecution of anyone. And I am no fan of Donald Trump, as I'm sure everybody on this webinar is not. But if we are to get our country back on the right track, we cannot stoop to his level. And I don't mean, when they go low, we go high. I'm not talking necessarily from a political standpoint. I'm talking from the standpoint of the rule of law. Is that if we advocate for the rule of law, if we are absolutely disgusted by Donald Trump's favor to pardon Steve Bannon, to pardon Roger Stone, who had potential criminal information about Donald Trump, to try to have Michael Flynn's case dismissed, to treat his friends and associates differently than we treat everybody else, to have two different standards of justice. If we are repulsed by that, as we all should be, we cannot now then turn around and say, I don't care what the evidence is. I don't care what our Constitution says, what due process is, what the rule of law is. I just want that guy in jail for whatever reason. Now, I understand the sentiment and I agree with the sentiment, but I think we need to be careful about trying to use the other side of the same coin. And we have to be better than that. If we believe in democracy and the rule of law, then we have to stand by it, even when it's not necessarily to our advantage. That is how we get back to a fully functioning democratic country that defeats this authoritarianism that's going around the country. Now, people will say, oh, you're soft and you got to fight tough with tough and you got to play hardball. That's what they do. I understand all that, and I don't disagree, when it comes to something like voting rights and the filibuster. We have to pass voting rights legislation no matter what it takes. And I don't care about getting rid, if we have to get rid of the filibuster, let's get rid of the filibuster. We don't have a partner in the Republican Party that is interested in doing anything other than preserving their own power and their own antiquated views of what the country should look like. And we're not going to have that partner with them. And what they're trying to do with these voting laws around the country is to try to lay the foundation to steal the next election. So the place to play hardball is getting that legislation passed under any circumstances. The place to play hardball, though, is not with our criminal justice system. And so I know people want blood, and I know they're like, oh, it's been a year since 1/6. Why isn't anyone jailed or imprisoned from Trump? I will tell you that one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle to understand is that if you read something in the newspaper, A, it does not mean it is true. B, it does, even if it's true, it does not mean that it is admissible in court as part of a criminal prosecution. You need to have a witness on the stand, firsthand witness, who can testify under oath to everything that you need to prove. You cannot put a journalist on the stand and say, oh, I heard from an anonymous source this, that, or the other thing. And so I think people fail to understand how much more difficult it is, and justifiably, because we're talking about people's liberty here, but how much more difficult it is to get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, under where all of the elements of an offense are met, versus what you might read in the newspaper or in a book, or you might hear other people say. It's much, much more complicated. It's much, much more difficult, and it requires a tremendous amount of work. And so, my biggest concern right now is not that nobody's been indicted, or the pace at which it's going. That's not my concern. These are complicated. They're complicated charges. They're significant charges that are potentially out there. It is not a situation where anybody is going slowly. My biggest concern is I don't see any signs that the Department of Justice is investigating the effort to overturn the election, separate and apart from January 6th. They're going guns blazing on investigating what happened on the day of January 6th. But to my mind, I don't think we're going to get a lot of criminal liability or a lot of indictments of people in the White House or connected to the Trump campaign from what happened on January 6th. I think where the real culpability lies with the White House, with Trump, with others around him, really is in the lead up to January 6th. And I think there's a lot of evidence that's now out in the public that makes it clear that at the very minimum, there needs to be a serious investigation as to whether or not Trump and others conspired to overturn the election, which is a federal crime. January 6th would be a part of that, but much of what occurred in the previous 2 months, even before the election, would also be even a more central part of it. And while I understand the Department of Justice, tries to keep things confidential, the reality is, and particularly with the Trump world, is we would hear about it. We would hear about it through litigation of a subpoena, or we would hear about it because their go-to defense is to cry foul and cry partisanship. And so they would want to get out there with that. I just think if there was an active investigation into that, we would hear about it. And so my biggest concern is that we haven't heard anything about it, notwithstanding Merrick Garland's, strong speech yesterday, which I think was a very strong speech and probably went further than one might have expected. But he didn't confirm that he was investigating the effort to overturn the election. He made a vague reference to crimes, separate from January 6th, or crimes related to an assault on democracy, which could be January 6th. It could be the effort to overturn the election. We don't know. But that is where my biggest concern lies, not in the speed with which either the committee or DOJ is moving.
President Biden today said that Trump and his supporters are attempting to rewrite the history of the insurrection. They want people to see Election Day itself as the day of the insurrection, and January 6th, an expression of the will of the people. Why is this dangerous? this messaging dangerous?
Well, this is the big lie. And this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning about truth. As you know, Trump is a serial liar. He can. I don't think he can actually tell the truth. I just think he says what he wants to be the truth and convinces himself that because he wants it and he believes he's invincible and he believes, he's as close to God as there is, that that it is therefore the truth. But the way that Trump operated for 4 years in the White House was to effectively say down is up and up is down, and that's the way it is. And you know what? I've got a whole party under my thumb and they'll believe me. And that's what's going on. I mean, 70% of the country thinks that Joe Biden was not lawfully elected. It's incredible. And so, we've got a lot of problems. Fox News is a huge problem. The right-wing media sphere is a huge problem because there are a lot of people who only listen to right-wing radio, who only watch Fox News. And if you do that, you will have no idea what truth actually is. You will just hear whatever Donald Trump's version of truth is. And that's not the objective truth. That's his own version. And so when you start to hear him talk about, the insurrection was November 3rd and January 6th was the protest, and he's still perpetuating the big lie, it's incredibly dangerous because the problem is, we're living, as someone called it, in the post-truth world, but we can't allow for that. And so he's perpetuating a big lie that he knows that his supporters will believe because they believe anything that he says. Because he has so many supporters in the Republican Party, he can dictate to the entire party what they're going to think. And it's embarrassing, it's shameful, but it is the reality that we're in. And we just have to continue to hammer home that this was the big lie, that he is lying. And slowly but surely, I do believe that over time, the majority of Americans will come to their senses.
Yeah, Dan, this is kind of a non-expert question. This is more of a political question. You, as a New Yorker, as a Democrat, as somebody who said what you just said, this is sort of, how does it make you feel knowing that 4 members of Congress from our own state, Stefanik, Malliotakis, Zeldin, and Jacobs, voted to overturn the election just hours after the attack that we've just been talking about and that we're commemorating here today? How does that make you feel? What do you think we should do about it?
So it's interesting you asked that question. I ended up, when I was down working in the House, I spent a lot of time with Stefanik and Zeldin. Stefanik was on the House Intelligence Committee, which is the committee I worked for. And Zeldin was very involved in the impeachment investigation from his role on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Stefanik in particular, the sort of devolution of her brand or her, set of beliefs, if to the extent she has any, has been startling. I mean, she's a smart, well-educated, promising, moderate Republican who just went off the deep end and saw an opportunity to move ahead by jumping on the Trump bandwagon. And, it's people like her and Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley who know better. I think there are some people, in Congress who aren't lawyers, who aren't, who just come from a very different background that's important in many respects, but in a lot of these respects, they're just not well equipped to sort of understand the nuances. At least Stefanik is very well equipped to understand what she's doing. And that is really, really difficult to swallow. When you see someone go from being, a relatively reasonable, moderate Republican, to just completely off the deep end as a Trump sycophant, it's disheartening. And so, Zeldin just operates in bad faith. I think he is just a complete political animal who doesn't have, a moral to stand on, and will do whatever is politically expedient for him. He also saw an opportunity and became, a Fox News fixture, and now, is running for governor. So, I did have some experience with them, and it's look, it's really problematic. I wish, in all truth, I wish we could go back to the days where, we had debates with Republicans about, foreign policy or tax policy, or, some of the critical things where we all knew everybody was operating in good faith. Sort of George W. Bush has never looked so good. I was not a fan of George W. Bush, but there was no question that George W. Bush had the United States' best interest in mind. And Donald Trump does not. Donald Trump has his own best interest, but he has the entire party captive to his whims. And it is more important than ever to remove anybody who supports the big lie, who supports Trumpism, who doesn't have the backbone and the morals to stand up for what he or she believes in, even if it means you lose an election. Okay, it's not the end of the world. Life goes on. How all of these people can completely sacrifice every moral fiber they have, every actual belief they have, just to hold on to the position they have. I don't understand how people can look themselves in the mirror. But I think what we need to do is make them look at themselves in a mirror as no longer a representative from New York.
Right. Absolutely.
I can't agree more. We're going to change it up a little bit. We have a couple of supporters here who want to ask you a couple of questions, and I see that people are putting their own questions in the Q&A, so we will try and get to those if we have time after we run through a couple of panelist questions. So first up is Kenneth Plummer. He has a question for you, Kenneth. Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. First, I just want to say thank you to No Surrender New York for hosting this important discussion and creating a statewide mechanism whereby elected officials can be supported. Dan, pleasure to meet you. I live in Westchester, which is home to the founder of the Proud Boys. We have violent, in many cases, racist extremists in our own communities, the same kind of people who attacked the Capitol last year. What are some real actions that have teeth and consequences that allow us to fight back against the normalization of extremism?
So there are a couple of different ways to go at this. One of the problems with our criminal laws is that there are no criminal laws designed or targeting domestic terrorists. If there are really severe laws for terrorism, for terrorists, for supporting terrorist organizations, but there's no way to really designate a domestic group as a terrorist organization. And so there's a hole in our criminal laws that makes it very difficult to treat these domestic violent extremist groups as what they are, which are terrorist organizations. There are a number of proposals, there have been a number of proposals in Congress to try to close that loophole. But they actually run into, I think, legitimate sort of First Amendment concerns. The ACLU has voiced a lot of concerns. It is you don't want to criminalize people's rights to assemble or rights to protest or whatever. And so there are some concerns about that, some legitimate, some I think less legitimate. But that's one problem that we have, which is we can't treat these domestic extremist groups like we have treated Al Qaeda or ISIS in other contexts, and yet I think they have the same goals in mind at this point. And so we have to recognize that. So I think one thing would be to close the loophole and provide stricter penalties for organizations, domestic violent extremist organizations. I will tell you, as a former organized crime prosecutor, I see a lot of different areas where I would want to pursue racketeering charges. And I think a lot of these organizations could be considered, as similar to the mafia is, as illegal criminal enterprises that can be charged through RICO. I think, frankly, the Trump organization is a criminal enterprise that could have been charged through RICO. And that's probably the best way to get to Donald Trump, is because he doesn't email, he doesn't text. It's very, he speaks, as you know by now, in code. It's very hard to charge him directly. But if he is leading an organization and you can prove that other people are involved in criminal activity and he's the head of that enterprise, you could theoretically charge him, as well as some of these other domestic violent extremist groups, as racketeering enterprises. So, I haven't heard much about whether that's something that the DOJ is looking at. I know that this is a top priority for DOJ, both for the FBI and the criminal division of the Department of Justice. Domestic violent extremism is at the very top of their concerns. And so I think we'll start to see more and more come out about these groups and limitations on these groups. But you raise a very good point, Kenneth. And I think your district attorney in Westchester, a good friend of mine, Mimi Roca, who was also the chief of the organized crime unit in the Southern District, is well aware of different ways to attack these problems.
Thank you.
I think she is. Next, we have Jimena Franchella. Jimena, want to ask Dan your question?
I think you're on mute, Jimena.
Yeah. Oh, Jimena, you're still on mute. See if we can. Yeah, there you go. I think you got it.
Bottom, there you are.
Yes,
Yep.
Thank you. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today to this very important discussion. What do you believe is the biggest threat to our democracy right now? And what concrete actions can we take to protect it?
The biggest threat, there are a lot of threats. And sadly, there are threats in so many different areas. To me, the biggest threat are these new state voting laws, which many of them have two components. One component is more traditional voter suppression. Basically, they're Republican. Many of these states, the Democrats still outnumber Republicans, but because of gerrymandering, some of them have predominantly Republican. Wisconsin's a great example of this, have overwhelmingly Republican legislatures. So what they're doing in order to preserve their own political future, essentially, I think the Republican Party is a dying party, and they are clinging on to life by becoming more and more extreme in the way that they are trying not only to suppress the vote of Democrats, which, I think in voting terms, they view it as essentially minorities and people of color who traditionally vote more Democratic. So they're trying to suppress the sort of poor and underserved and people of color from voting. Now, some of it is just egregious and ridiculous and should be condemned and should be challenged in court and should be litigated. But, sad to say, that's been a part of our history for a long time. And B, it is something that we can overcome. We don't want to have people sit in line for 6 hours in order to vote, but they can. There are, generally speaking, there are ways around a lot of these suppressions. It takes a lot more effort, but you can do it. But what is really scary is the second aspect of these laws, which are essentially correcting the errors that occurred from their view in 2020 and that prevented the coup from actually working. And so what they're doing is they're now empowering partisan elected officials to have much greater authority over the outcome of the election in each state, in their respective states. And so you can kind of kick if there are, I think in one state, if there's an allegation of fraud that could potentially impact the overall vote, it might go to an elected official to make a decision as to, who won for that state. Don't quote me on that, but it's almost that bad, if not that bad. And so the biggest threat to our democracy are these new laws that are being implemented that are really designed to allow what they hope will be Republican elected officials to overturn the will of the voters if they need to. Now, that is as anti-democratic as it gets. And the idea that what failed in 2020 could happen again in 2024 is not only not far-fetched, it's what they're trying to do in many of these states around the country. So to me, that is the biggest threat, separate and apart from Donald Trump. But let's just put that aside, because I do think in order to get rid of Trump, we kind of have to cut the legs out from under him in dealing with some of these other issues, such as voting rights. And the solution, by the way, is to pass these two laws that are in the Senate right now, waiting to be passed: the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Act. If we pass them, the gerrymandering, is significantly reduced. Automatic voter registration. None of these efforts to allow for politicians to overturn the will of the people will happen. So these laws are the solution.
And finally, Barry Grobart also has a question. Barry?
Thanks, Shannon. And Dan, thanks for joining. I will just, Shannon and Tom, great job getting Dan. I know MSNBC was able to get him on January 5th, but you guys got him on the anniversary. So kudos to No Surrender New York. Just a quick question, Dan. When I look at who was in, there were, I think, 57 people at last count who were either protested or stormed the Capitol, who are now using it as a springboard to run for political office. And that, that would have been totally disqualifying in the past. What's changed and how do we deal with that?
What's changed is Donald Trump. I mean, I hate to continue to harp on it, but we've never had any. Look, our country, our Constitution, our republic is founded on the idea that everyone recognizes their oath to obey the Constitution. That is what is fundamental to a functioning government based on separation of powers. You have to recognize and acknowledge that our Constitution creates this separation of powers to promote democracy, and for a reason. You have to recognize that there are inalienable rights that individuals have. The Constitution is what Donald Trump wants it to be. And he gets frustrated that Congress may, have a role in providing a check on him, which is why he said he would defy all the subpoenas. So the only reason these people are running is because of the perpetuation of the big lie, of whitewashing what occurred on January 6th, and of essentially extorting the Republican members of Congress and senators to at least stay mum and stay quiet when he goes off spouting about the big lie and the rigged election and all this stuff. But there are enough people that believe him and support him that make these other Republicans who might be more reasonable, maybe not, stay quiet, and that give a perch to people who were there on January 6th, because there's a good portion of the country, and certainly those people's districts, wherever they are, that believe that the insurrection was November 3rd and the protest was January 6th, and they took the election away from me. And that's what they're spouting. I mean, they view themselves as, quote, patriots who were there to uphold democracy on January 6th. And so that's how they are able to do this. You know, what the most disappointing thing, and I know we have a few more minutes, I want to get some questions, but I truly, if I am to pinpoint my biggest disappointment over the last couple of years, it's at the extent to which there are reasonable, intelligent, rational Republicans who have just cowered in the face of Donald Trump. And the best way to, eliminate Donald Trump, and I said this at the time, frankly, I don't understand why 20 Republican senators didn't get together after second impeachment and convict him. And it would have neutered his power. If he could not run again, he could not have a campaign fund, a campaign committee. He could not raise money. His endorsement would matter less. He couldn't throw money around. They basically could have completely cut the legs out from under him and preserved their party. And they chose not to. And I don't understand why they didn't. I think there were enough senators who thought that he should have been convicted, but several of them were too worried about their own political future to be able to do that. And my disappointment is in these Republicans who are so much more worried about their own personal fortunes, political fortunes, than they are about the country, and that they won't stand up to him like Liz Cheney, like Adam Kinzinger. And that's frankly why this organization is so important. These people need to be booted out of office. If they can't stand up to someone who is as corrupt and immoral and operates in bad faith and anything else you want to say as Donald Trump, then they don't deserve to be an elected representative in this country.
We have time for one audience Q&A. I'm going to kind of take what the sentiment and some of the questions are and combine it into one. And that also ties into the theory of the pack, is that we can help hold on to the House by maximizing wins that come out of redistricting and holding on to the seats that we have to expand Democratic representation here in New York. It can be the blue firewall. What happens if we lose the House? What happens to all these investigations? What happens if the Republicans are in control? What do you see that scenario being?
Well, the select committee is disbanded immediately, unless they create another, bogus committee to, I don't know, investigate Hillary's emails or something, but they could, come up with something to investigate. I think what you're going to see is they're going to, hold hearings on immigration, that they're going to press the administration on all sorts of stuff. And frankly, just won't know, there will be zero legislation that is passed in 2 years at a minimum. If the Republicans take either house, House of Congress, they will literally refuse to pass anything, is my prediction, particularly in the House. I think the Senate is a little bit more, can be more reasonable. You saw it with the infrastructure bill, but they're pretty far gone as well. So I don't think, I could come up with a parade of horribles, Frankly, all of them will probably be true. I mean, the idea that Kevin McCarthy would be Speaker of the House makes my stomach turn. That guy is as fraudulent and phony as anyone can be. And he is a real danger to, you know, to what can happen. I think that they'll find all sorts of investigations to just grind the wheels of what's going on. They will certainly not investigate anything related to the Trump administration or January 6th. And my guess is they'll start to try to grease the wheels for Donald Trump to win in 2024. So, you know, you raise a very important point. And I think something, you know, that I'm sure you guys will think about and that we need to learn from is we've got to get good candidates. You know, we've got to find candidates in these red or purple districts who can resonate with the people in those areas. I don't think, you know, you can sort of paratroop in people who are outside of the broader mainstream of those purple districts and hope to win. But more importantly, and more than anything, it's got to be messaging. The 2 years ago, defund the police killed members of Congress. This past year, around New York, bail reform just killed the Democratic candidates. And the fact of the matter is, the messaging we got from the opposition was inaccurate. And the allegations of, you know, the New York Post whatever, New York Postification of bail reform was not actually supported by the data. Defund the police is just a terrible term. The idea of putting, you know, as a prosecutor, of the idea of putting police in a position for them to do what they're trained to do and do it effectively makes a lot of sense. And that's not doing 911 calls all the time, where many of them are domestic disputes, et cetera. So yeah, there are ways that we should be fixing our system, but who comes up with these, you know, terminology? I don't know. And who is controlling the messaging? I don't know either. But those were the overarching things in the last two elections that got Democrats beat when we should not have lost. We should not have lost a lot of those elections, but those two issues scared voters to the point where we lost those elections. So, you know, I know what you guys are thinking about doing is helping out with a lot of the messaging. And I think it's critically important that the message has to be strong, it has to be aggressive, and it has to be really well thought out.
You're absolutely right. We have to be on offense when it comes to the messaging, and it has to be solid. All right. Thank you so much, Dan. I'm going to toss it to Tom to kind of wrap us up now.
Thank you, Shannon. And thank you, Dan. That was just fabulous. It was a really, really terrific conversation. Thanks to everybody. I have been watching the chat for supporting No Surrender New York. As several people have said, we both need and appreciate your support. Together, we're going to work to elect more Democrats. We're going to hold the House. The link has appeared many times in the chat, but you know, some of you may get some follow-up emails too, so we'll see how that goes. To Dan's point about messaging, in 2 weeks, this is the first in a series of events that we're doing like this. In 2 weeks, we will welcome political media critic Eric Boehlert from MSNBC, Salon, Rolling Stone, and his own press-run newsletter on January 20th, which is, of course, the anniversary of Joe Biden's inauguration. And Eric will talk about the failure of many in mainstream media to counter the radicalism of Trump and how they cover Biden. So Dan, that was actually a perfect handoff. So you will not want to miss that important conversation. So please join us. Everyone, have a great night. Stay safe, and thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a good night.